If this doesn't shock you, nothing will. The food bowl hit the floorboards and spun, scattering dry kibble into the shadows. Ghost didn't touch a single piece. Mason Reed stood beside the stove and watched his German shepherd back away from the bowl like it was wrong. Ghost was disciplined, stubborn, protective, smarter than most men Mason had served beside, and never careless with food. Not after war. Not after the hungry months when both of them had learned what survival actually cost. Yet now Ghost stood by the back door, ears forward, body rigid, eyes fixed not on the bowl, but on the black window over the sink and the woods beyond it. Ghost! The dog didn't move. Mason felt the old change happen before he wanted it. The quiet man living in the hills stepped back. The harder man, the one who survived by noticing what didn't fit, stepped forward. The slope behind the cabin dropped into cedar and fir. Beyond that lay a narrow wash where stormwater ran after hard rain. Farther out, the ridge flattened into a broken stretch of ground Mason rarely crossed. Tonight, Ghost stared at it like a grave had split open. Mason looked back at the bowl. "You're refusing dinner for that?" Ghost turned just enough to make sure Mason was watching. Then he faced the woods again and lifted one paw slightly off the floor, pointing. The dog had learned that in another life, under another set of commands shouted through dust and gunfire. He used it only when instinct and training fused so completely that ignoring him became stupid. Mason opened the back door. Cold air rushed in, carrying rain, wet bark, and the mineral bite of fresh-turned soil. Ghost slipped past him without waiting and moved down the slope with a speed that said he had already waited too long. Mason grabbed the flashlight hanging by the frame, shoved his feet into his boots, and stepped into the night. Mud sucked at the porch steps. Rain had eased from a storm into a fine cold drift. Water moved somewhere below through rock. Thunder rolled far off. Ghost paced ahead and stopped near the first drop in the slope. One paw up. Nose low. Eyes fixed on the dark. Mason swept the flashlight across the ground and found torn moss, broken brush, a shallow line carved through mud that had, on the bottom, half buried beneath mud, lay what looked like rotted tarp. Then the flashlight found the corner of steel. A flat edge. Manufactured. Rain had stripped away just enough dirt to reveal a rusted hinge plate on one side and part of a recessed pull ring on the other. A hatch. Ghost dropped into the trench before Mason could stop him. He sniffed the seam hard, then pawed at the mud over the metal, and looked back up with a sound halfway between a whine and a warning. "Out!" Mason said quietly. Ghost didn't obey. He pawed harder. Mud splashed. One more scrape revealed a black stripe beneath the dirt. Military. Mason climbed down into the trench. The walls muted the woods at once. Rain still moved above through branches, but down here the air felt colder and stiller. Mason crouched beside the hatch and put his gloved fingers against the steel. Ghost sniffed along the far edge, then snapped his head uphill. Mason followed the motion, light jumping to the ridge. Nothing. No figure. No movement beyond the dripping cedar tips. But the same sensation slid through him anyway, that old certainty that somebody, somewhere, had just gone still because he looked in the right direction. His hand drifted toward the pistol under his jacket. Ghost's growl deepened. Then the dog turned back and pressed his nose to the steel again, urgently. Mason leaned lower. There were fresh scratches near the pull ring. Tool damage. Someone had tried to force this open recently. One corner still held a ribbon of black synthetic fabric snagged under the hinge. He pulled it free. Tactical shell material. A memory flashed without permission. Another torn strip of black fabric. Another night full of rain and shouted coordinates, and a teammate moving through a breach before Mason could stop him. He shoved the thought down. Ghost barked at him. Mason set the flashlight on a root so the beam cut across the hatch. Then he hooked both fingers through the ring and pulled. Nothing. He reset his stance, drove one boot against the trench wall for leverage, and hauled harder. A small sound answered him from below. He froze. Ghost heard it too. Mason lowered himself until his ear nearly touched the hatch. At first, there was only the faint hum of closed space. Then, from somewhere under the steel, came 3 tiny knocks. Knuckles. Not water. Not settling. Not random. Ghost barked once, and started clawing at the mud over the hinge line, so hard dirt sprayed over Mason's sleeves. Easy! The dog ignored him. Mason put his mouth near the ring. If someone's down there, knock again. Silence. Then the answer came. 2 knocks. A pause. 1 knock. A pattern. Human. Ghost backed out of the trench in a single bound, turned uphill, and barked furiously into the trees. Mason whipped the flashlight up just in time to catch a dark shape moving between trunks 40 yards away. A man. Only a shoulder and part of a hood, but enough. The figure vanished behind Cedar's shadow before Mason could get a clean line on him. Mason came up with the pistol already in his hand. Who's there? No reply. Ghost stayed fixed on the ridge, teeth bared, body rigid. Mason scanned left, then right. Nothing moved. But he knew the feeling. Someone had watched Ghost refuse food, watched Mason follow, watched him find the hatch, and was still close enough to hear him breathe. Another knock came from under the steel. This time weaker. Ghost swung back toward Mason and barked once as if to say choose. Mason looked from the trees to the hatch. Threat above. Possible victim below. No good choices. Only faster ones. He holstered the pistol, grabbed the pry bar from his belt, and drove the flat end into the mudcake seam beside the hinge. The first just slipped. The second bit. He put his full weight on it. Russ groaned. Mud cracked loose and slid down the trench wall. Ghost dug beside him now, whining through clenched teeth as if he could feel time thinning. The hinge gave half an inch. Mason reset the bar, gritted his teeth, and levered harder. The hatch moved. Not much. Just enough to break the seal. A breath of air pushed out from underneath, cold and chemical, carrying the faint trace of bleach beneath old soil and rust. Mason's stomach tightened. Ghost froze mid-scratch. From the darkness under the opening, something shifted. Then a voice rose through the crack, so softly Mason almost thought the mountain had made it. Help me! He stared at the slit of black opening. The flashlight shook once in his hand. Up on the ridge, a branch snapped. Ghost whirled, barking into the dark with pure fury. And from somewhere behind the trees, a second voice shouted, "Don't let him open it!" That voice hit Mason harder than the warning itself. It was close. Male. Controlled. Commanding. Like someone who knew exactly what was under the steel, and was terrified of losing control of it. Ghost stepped directly over the hatch, faced the hidden voice in the woods, and bared his teeth as if he was willing to die protecting whatever was buried beneath his paws. Mason looked at the dog, then at the half-broken seal, then at the dark line of trees where the unseen man had vanished. And for the first time since stepping into the trench, he realized the hidden hatch was not the real mystery. The real mystery was why a stranger in the woods feared him opening it more than the person trapped below feared staying inside. Mason did not answer the voice in the trees. He answered with steel. He drove the pry bar deeper into the hatch seam, and put all his weight on it. Russ shrieked. Mud tore loose in clumps. The hidden trench seemed to tighten around him, the smell of open earth mixing with cold metal and Ghost's warning growl. Above them, the unseen man shouted again. "Step away from it!" Ghost exploded in a bark so violent it slapped echoes off the trench walls. Mason turned and caught movement on the ridge, one dark figure between cedar trunks, not rushing, just repositioning. Another voice rose from under the hatch. Female. Shaking. Closer now. Please, please don't leave. That settled it. Mason jammed one boot against the trench wall, hauled the pry bar harder, and felt the left side of the hatch rise another inch. Cold air burst up through the widening seam, carrying bleach, antiseptic, concrete, old power, human fear. Ghost swung from the ridge back to the hatch and whined once. Not fear. Urgency. Mason crouched lower and shoved his fingers into the gap. The steel was heavier than it looked. Purpose-built. Reinforced from below. A shot cracked through the rain. Mud burst from the trench wall inches from Mason's face. Ghost lunged uphill with murder in his eyes, but Mason caught the harness just before the dog launched out of the trench. Hold! Ghost fought him for half a second, then stopped, shaking, snarling, eyes locked on the ridge. Mason dropped flat in the mud and brought the pistol up. The shooter was no longer hiding well. A dark shape moved between two trunks above the trench line, trying to angle for a cleaner shot. Black shell jacket. Hood up. Rifle. Someone who had come here because of what was under the steel. Mason fired once. The man ducked back behind the cedar, and the wood snapped into silence again. Professional. From beneath the hatch came 3 rapid knocks. Then a weak scrape. The person below had heard the shot too. Mason holstered the pistol, grabbed the pry bar again, and forced the hatch up another 2 inches. The strain tore through his shoulders. Mud slid under his boots. Ghost braced against his hip. Can you move? Mason called down into the gap. For 1 second, nothing answered but stale air and distant humming. Then the woman's voice came back, rougher now. There are 3 of us here. More lower. They'll come back if you stop. That sentence hit him wrong. Not if you leave. If you stop. As if opening, the hatch had already started something. A second voice came from below. Male. Low. Controlled through pain. Don't talk loud. Mason froze. That voice carried command in it. Not civilian panic. Mason leaned down toward the crack. Who's in there? Silence. Then the woman whispered, Open it first. The man below did not argue with her. That was almost worse. Up on the ridge, a second shape appeared farther left. Mason saw only part of it, a shoulder, a flash of dark fabric, a glint where rain touched metal, but it was enough. 2 armed men now. Both careful. Both trying not to lose the hatch. Ghost snarled toward the new angle. Mason snapped the pistol up and fired at the left side tree line. Not to kill. To break their movement. The shot cracked across the ravine. A branch splintered. One shadow disappeared low behind brush. Mason instantly dropped the pistol, grabbed the hatch ring with both hands, and hauled upward with everything he had. The steel screamed and shifted. This time the seal broke. The hatch rose to the width of his forearm before its weight fought him again. Ghost shoved his shoulder under Mason's arm, lifting with him, barking furiously into the widening dark. Mason jammed the pry bar down crosswise under the lip to hold it. A rectangle of black opened beneath them. Then the flashlight beam slipped in. A steel ladder. Concrete shaft. White painted walls below. And at the bottom of the ladder, maybe 10 feet down, a narrow landing with a floor drain, a blinking red emergency light, and 3 human figures crowded together. The woman was the closest. Mid-30s maybe, face bruised, hair hacked unevenly at shoulder level, institutional gray shirt hanging loose from weight loss. One hand over her mouth, as if she didn't trust herself to hope too loudly. Beside her stood an older man, with one wrist chained to a pipe bracket. And the third figure, Mason's breath caught. Broad shoulders even half-starved. Dark beard. One eye swollen at the corner. A face pulled from memory, and a military death file. Aaron Velez. Chief Petty Officer Aaron Velez. Declared dead 3 years ago, after a black recovery operation went wrong so badly Mason still woke with it in his teeth. The man looked up through the gap into the rain and flashlight glare. "Mason?" The trench seemed to fall away under him. For one impossible second, he was back there again. Burning dust, a collapsed stairwell, radio static, somebody screaming Valesa's name, and then the silence after command told him the structure was lost and anyone inside it was already dead. Ghost's growl cut through the memory. Mason blinked hard and stared down. "You're dead." Aaron let out a humorless breath. "Convenient, isn't it?" The woman beside him grabbed his arm. "Don't do this now." Aaron didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on Mason with the hard, damaged focus of someone measuring whether rescue was real or just another rearranged nightmare. "Get them out," Mason said. Aaron's expression changed instantly. Not relief. Alarm. "No!" That single word hit harder than the gunshots. Mason stared down at him. "What?" Aaron stepped toward the ladder until the chain on his wrist snapped him short. "If you open this all the way before we lock the lower hall, they move everyone. Not just us." The woman rounded on him, half sob, half fury. "If he closes it, we die here." A gunshot snapped overhead. The pry bar shuddered. The hatch almost slammed shut on Mason's fingers. Ghost spun and launched out of the trench this time before Mason could catch him. The German Shepherd hit the near ridge bank, tore uphill through brush, and vanished into the rain with a roar. A man shouted. Then another. Then the savage snarling sound of a fight too close to stop. Mason grabbed the hatch ring and hauled again, widening the opening enough to see more of the landing below. White tile corridor beyond. Bolted restraint chair overturned against the wall. A security camera dome cracked but still lit. And down beyond a bend, a strip of red emergency lighting bleeding across the floor. Not an old bunker. A facility. Hidden under his land. The woman below saw his face change and whispered, "Now you understand." "No," Mason said. "I really don't." Aaron looked past him toward the rain. "Then learn fast." Ghost came back into view at the top of the trench like a storm creature, for blackened with rain and mud, one shoulder smeared dark with someone else's blood. He planted himself above Mason, barking into the trees, forcing whoever was out there to keep their distance. Another shot came, wider now. The man on the ridge had lost his clean angle. Mason dropped lower to the opening. "How many inside?" The woman answered first. "3 here. More down below." Aaron corrected her without softness. "If they haven't already moved them." "Moved them where?" Mason was about to ask when the red light on the lower landing changed. It began pulsing faster. Aaron saw it and went pale beneath the bruises. "No," he said. The woman backed away from the ladder, shaking her head. "Please no." Somewhere deeper below, heavy machinery woke. Not one lock. A sequence. Metal disengaging in stages, deep enough that Mason felt it through the trench floor and into his ribs. The sound rolled upward like the mountain itself was unbolting. Ghost stopped barking. The dog turned slowly from the trees and looked back down into the shaft. One paw lifted, pointing again. Not at Aaron. Not at the woman. Past them. At something deeper below the landing that Mason could not yet see. Aaron followed the line of the dog's stare, and his face emptied. Mason heard the first scream a second later. It came from far below the landing, carried up through vents and corridor turns, cut short so suddenly it felt swallowed. Then another. Then 3 more. The woman clamped both hands over her mouth. Mason felt the trench walls close in, the rain overhead vanish, the whole night narrowing to the widening hatch, and the terrible fact that Ghost had not led him to a buried victim. He had led him to the entrance of something larger. And whatever had just started moving below them was the real reason armed men in the woods were more afraid of this hatch opening than the people trapped beneath it were of staying buried. The first scream died so suddenly it felt cut off by a hand. Mason stayed crouched over the open hatch with mud soaking through both knees, and the flashlight beam pinned on the lower landing. Ghost stood above him in the trench, rigid again, one paw lifted toward the black throat of the facility while rain hissed over the exposed earth. Aaron Velez had gone pale. Then the second scream came. Closer. Longer. And followed by feet slamming concrete somewhere far below the landing. Mason looked down at Aaron. "What did I open?" Aaron answered without looking at him. "The transfer floor." Gunfire cracked again from the ridge. Dirt burst from the trench wall beside Ghost. The shepherd lunged uphill with such force that only the narrow trench kept him from clearing out of it. Mason fired once toward the cedar line. The shadow vanished. From beneath the hatch came 3 rapid knocks. Then a weak scrape. Mason forced the hatch up another 2 inches. Mud slid under his boots. Ghost braced against his hip. "Can you move?" Mason called down. For 1 second, only stale air and distant humming answered. She said, "There are 3 of us here. More lower. They'll come back if you stop." "Not if you leave." "If you stop." A second voice came from below, low and controlled through pain. "Don't talk loud." That voice carried command in it. Mason leaned lower. "Who's in there?" "Open it first," she whispered. Up on the ridge, a second shape appeared farther left. Mason saw only a shoulder, a flash of dark fabric, the glint of metal and rain, but it was enough. 2 armed men now. Both careful. Both trying not to lose the hatch. Ghost snarled toward the new angle. Mason fired into the left side tree line. A branch splintered. One shadow dropped low behind brush. Mason instantly grabbed the hatch ring with both hands and hauled upward with everything he had. The steel screamed and shifted. The hatch rose to the width of his forearm before the weight fought him again. Ghost shoved his shoulder under Mason's arm, lifting with him, barking furiously into the widening dark. Mason jammed the pry bar under the lip to hold it. A rectangle of black opened beneath them. Then the flashlight beam slipped in. A steel ladder. Concrete shaft. White painted walls below. And at the bottom, a narrow landing under a blinking red emergency light held 3 human figures. Beside the woman stood an older man with one wrist chained to a pipe bracket. And the third figure, Mason's breath caught. Broad shoulders even half-starved. Dark beard. One eye swollen at the corner. A face pulled from memory and a military death file. Aaron Velez. The man looked up through the gap. "Mason?" Ghost's growl cut through the memory. Mason blinked hard. "You're dead." Aaron let out a humorless breath. "Convenient, isn't it?" "Get them out," Mason said. Aaron's expression changed instantly. Not relief. Alarm. "No!" Mason stared down at him. "What?" Aaron stepped toward the ladder until the chain on his wrist snapped him short. "If you open this all the way before we lock the lower hall, they move everyone. Not just us." A gunshot snapped overhead. The hatch almost slammed shut on Mason's fingers. Ghost spun and launched out of the trench before Mason could catch him. The German shepherd hit the near ridge bank, tore uphill through brush, and vanished into the rain with a roar. A man shouted. Then another. Then the savage snarling sound of a fight too close to stop. Mason grabbed the hatch ring and hauled again, widening the opening enough to see more of the landing below. White tile corridor. Overturned restraint chair. Cracked camera dome. Red emergency light beyond a bend. A facility hidden under his land. Aaron looked past him toward the rain. Then learn fast. Ghost came back into view at the top of the trench, blood on one shoulder, forcing whoever was out there to keep their distance. Another shot came, wider now. The man on the ridge had lost his clean angle. Mason dropped lower to the opening. "How many inside?" Aaron corrected her. "If they haven't already moved them." The red light on the lower landing changed. It began pulsing faster. Aaron saw it and went pale. "No!" Somewhere deeper below, heavy machinery woke. Not one lock. A sequence. Metal disengaging in stages, deep enough that Mason felt it through the trench floor and into his ribs. The sound rolled upward like the mountain itself was unbolting. Ghost stopped barking. The dog turned from the trees and pointed again, not at the people below, but at something deeper past them. Aaron followed the line of the dog's stare, and his face emptied. Mason heard the first scream a second later. It came from far below the landing, carried up through vents and corridor turns, cut short so suddenly it felt swallowed. Then another. Then three more. Mason felt the trench walls close in, the rain overhead vanish, the whole night narrowing to the widening hatch, and the terrible fact that Ghost had not led him to a buried victim. He had led him to the entrance of something larger. And whatever had just started moving below them was the reason armed men in the woods were more afraid of this hatch opening than the people trapped beneath it were of staying buried. The third scream turned into many. Men, women, someone young, then the flat metallic cough of automatic fire somewhere far below the landing. Not warning shots. Containment. Clara folded over. "They're clearing the lower hull." Mason looked down sharply. "Your name?" "Clara." "Subject blocks," Clara whispered. Then she let out one terrible laugh. "That's what they call you when they don't want to say prisoner." Mason dropped back to the opening. "Can you climb?" Aaron stepped to the ladder at once. The chain on his wrist snapped taut and stopped him. Mason's beam followed it to a steel cuff lock through a wall-mounted eyelet. Aaron saw Mason reading it. "They moved us up here after the first alarm." Then the corridor behind Aaron flashed white, not from lightning but from emergency strips. Another sealed door sat to the right. Vapor moved in the red light like breath. Clara stepped toward the ladder. Aaron grabbed her forearm. "If you climb now, you die in this shaft." She rounded on him. "I know exactly how they clean the lower hull." Mason leaned lower. "Tell me." Clara looked up. "Gas first. Then lights. Then they move whoever still obeys and bury whoever doesn't." A heavy impact shook the lower corridor. Then another. Then a third. Mason saw a shadow move past the far intersection. Not operator fast. Not tactical. A person running blind. A gaunt man in gray institutional clothes burst into the landing corridor below and ran for the ladder shaft. Then a second figure hit him from behind, and both vanished below the lip. The scream that came next was so short Mason almost doubted he had heard it. Ghost erupted into barking. Clara folded over. The old chained man closed his good eye. Aaron kept sawing at the cuff pin with the knife Mason had thrown down. Then Mason saw the second problem. Deep in the crossing corridor behind the landing, a green light blinked on over a security panel. Green lines pulsed in wet tile. Aaron followed Mason's stare and swore. "Gas. How long?" "Depends which corridor they want alive." Aaron shouted for something to cut steel. Mason threw down his knife. Aaron caught it and went straight to the cuff pin while Clara braced the chain. The old man steadied Aaron. Mason asked if he could climb. "If I'm alive when it's time," he said. Then the thing below hit the landing door. The sound came from the right side sealed door 10 feet behind Aaron. The handle jolted once. Then again. Then began to shudder in a rapid, violent rhythm. Clara whispered, "No!" Aaron cut at the cuff harder. "Open the hatch more." Mason shoved the pry bar deeper and hauled the hatch another few inches. The opening widened enough now that a person could squeeze through if they didn't panic. Cold white air rolled out around his wrists. Then the right side door burst inward below. Not fully. Halfway. Enough for the frame to split and a hand to slam through. A pale hand slammed through, bloodied knuckles, and a restraint band still clipped to the wrist. Another hand came after it. Then a face jammed into the gap, female, shaved scalp, one eye nearly shut, mouth red with blood. She saw the hatch above, and made a sound so raw it cut through the rain, the gunfire, and the machinery all at once. Please! She wasn't attacking. She was trying to reach daylight. Something behind her yanked. Her fingers slipped. Aaron shouted, "Back!" Too late. She was ripped sideways out of the broken doorway by force strong enough to smash her skull against the frame. She vanished into the corridor with a scream that broke into choking halfway through. Mason never saw what took her, only the smear of blood left across the white door. Then a new sound rolled over the ridge above the trench. An engine. Coming fast through service track. Headlights flashed between the cedar trunks. They were bringing more. The headlights cut through the cedar trunks in white bars and turned the rain silver. Mason looked up from the trench and saw them bouncing fast down the service track above the property. 2, maybe 3 behind them. Whoever owned the men in the trees had called for wait, and wait was coming. Ghost barked toward the ridge, then snapped back toward the hatch, torn between the trapped people below and the armed movement closing from above. Aaron heard the engines too. "You're out of time." Mason dropped to one knee at the opening. "Then give me something useful." Aaron held up the chain biting through his wrist. "Cut me loose or leave me." Clara rounded on him. "Those are not the same thing." The old man with the bad eye finally spoke. "He means if you take too long, none of us leave." Another impact shook the landing door on the right. Blood striped the white frame. Something scraped low across tile. Nails. Fingers. Desperation. Then the green gas light in the crossing corridor changed to amber. Aaron saw it and swore. "Not gas first." "What does amber mean?" Mason asked. Clara answered without taking her eyes off the corridor. "Recovery live." A shape moved past the far crossing. Black armor. Full visor. Compact rifle. Fast. A second figure moved behind the first. Then a third. The lower teen was already inside. Above the trench, branches whipped as the first vehicle skidded to a stop on the track. Doors opened. Men shouted. White beams cut through wet trunks. Mason's mind split the problem instantly. Surface teen closing. Lower recovery rising. Hatch half open. No time. He stripped the secondary knife from his boot and tossed it down. Aaron caught it one-handed. Mason shouted, "Can you climb with the cuff on?" Aaron looked at the chain, then back up. "If I have a hand free." The old man stepped in close and took the chain. "Then cut." Clara grabbed the other side and pulled the wrist away from the eyelet to expose the pin. Aaron started sawing. Mason looked past them into the crossing corridor again. The first recovery operator appeared fully now at the far intersection, shield leading, rifle canted off the side. He stopped the instant he saw the hatch above. Instead of firing, he dropped behind the wall and vanished. Mason felt colder at that than he would have at a shot. "They don't want to hit the shaft," Aaron said. "Why?" "Because they still need what's under it." Another voice echoed from deeper below. Female. Calm. Over speakers Mason couldn't see. "Subject lane realignment in process. Secure upper breach. Preserve priority bloodlines." Clara shut her eyes once. "Mara." Mason caught the name. "Who?" No one answered. The right side door burst wider below. A woman in a stained gray shirt crashed shoulder first into the frame, twisted, and looked straight up toward the hatch. Her head had been shaved close. A plastic band still ringed one wrist. Her face was bruised nearly purple on one side. Her eyes found Mason. Hope crossed them so suddenly it felt violent. "Please," she said, voice tearing. "Please don't let them send my son." Something behind her seized the back of her shirt and yanked hard. She screamed once and vanished into the room. The sound that followed was not a gunshot. It was a cattle prod crack. High. Electrical. Followed by a body hitting tile. Ghost barked so hard spittle flew white in the flashlight beam. Mason raised the pistol and fired into the broken doorway on instinct. The round punched sparks off the frame. The hall answered. Automatic fire ripped from the far crossing, stitching low across the landing. Clara dropped. The old man jerked Aaron sideways behind the ladder base. Chips of concrete flew from the wall. Mason ducked back from the opening as bullets snapped through the gap and whined off the trench walls. The men below had changed their rules. No more preserving the shaft. Now they were willing to chew the edges if it meant keeping the people inside. Up on the service track, a loudspeaker barked through the rain. "Step away from the trench." Ghost launched upward with a roar. Mason caught only a blur of fur and muscle before the dog vanished over the trench edge again. A man shouted in panic. Another shouted for cover. A shotgun blast boomed from the ridge. Mason fired once toward the sound and dropped back to the opening. Aaron had almost cut through the cuff pin. Almost. Below them, the crossing corridor filled with white light. A row of hard industrial lamps kicked on in sequence, bleaching the far hall. Mason saw everything at once now. The shield operator. A second man behind him with some kind of canister unit. A third dragging a compact wheel case. And farther back, through the glare, a woman standing still while everyone else worked. Mid-30s. Dark hair pulled flat. Gray coat. One hand folded behind her back. She didn't wear armor. She stood like command. Clara saw her and made a sound like she had been stabbed. "No!" The woman lifted her chin toward the shaft. When she spoke, the voice came through hidden ceiling speakers and the hall at once. "Surface breach confirmation complete. Upper retrieval team, hold position. Lower team, retain live subjects. Do not damage chamber 14. Aaron's knife stopped moving. The old man stared into the light. Clara's breathing turned ragged. Mason looked from one face to another. "Who is she?" No one answered. Then the woman in the hall looked up through the glare and directly into the beam of Mason's flashlight. For the first time, emotion touched her face. Recognition. She stepped one pace closer. "Mason Reed," she said. He felt the name land like a tag being clipped on him. Ghost barked above, then yelped. Mason half rose toward the trench rim, but Aaron snapped. "Stay on the shaft!" The woman below kept her eyes on Mason. There was something wrong about her face. Not familiarity exactly. Echo. The mouth line. The brow. The angle around the eyes when she narrowed them. Enough to unsettle. She spoke again. "I wondered whether the dog would bring you in." Every muscle in Mason's back tightened. "You know Ghost?" The faintest almost smile touched her mouth and vanished. "I know what your line does under separation pressure," Clara whispered. "Don't." The woman ignored her. "You shouldn't have opened intake before lower transfer cleared. That was careless." Mason stared down into the light and felt the whole night shift under him. "Who are you?" This time the old man answered. The chained elder with the ruined eye looked up from the ladder base and said it with exhausted hatred. "Mara Vale." The surname hit harder than the gunfire had. Vale. The men in the trees. The hidden facility. The voices through the speakers. All of it now had a face. Mara heard the name spoken aloud and finally looked at the old man. Her control slipped by a fraction. "You are still alive," she said. The old man gave a bloodless smile. "Disappointing, isn't it?" Aaron resumed sawing the cuff pin faster now. "Mason, if she's here, the lower vault's moving." "What vault?" Clara answered in a whisper. "Families." Mason looked at her sharply. She was crying without making a sound. Mara lifted one hand, and the shield operator advanced half a step. "Enough," she said. "Lieutenant Reed, step down into the shaft. You are safer with us than with what's arriving above." As if summoned by the sentence, a laser dot appeared on the trench wall 6 inches from Mason's cheek. Then a second dot. Then a third. Surface team above. Lower team below. His body in the middle. Ghost barked again on the ridge, then a man screamed. Mason risked one glance upward. Headlights washed the upper trees. At least 4 men now, moving around the trench with disciplined spacing. One lay on his back in the mud, clutching his arm while Ghost circled him, and snapped at anyone who tried to close. Another man had a long gun trained down into the trench, red laser shaking through rain. Mason dropped back under the line of sight. Aaron ripped the blade free and held up the cuff. Broken loose. The relief lasted less than a heartbeat, because the wall opposite the ladder on the lower landing shuttered. A seam Mason had mistaken for poured concrete suddenly outlined itself in red. A hidden door. Heavy locks began cycling inside it with a deep mechanical clunk. Aaron's face emptied. Clara backed into the pipe wall. "No, no, no." The old man shut his eye. Mara did not turn toward the opening. She already knew what it was. When she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of disappointment that only made the fear worse. "You took too long." The hidden door began to open, and from the black widening gap behind it, a child's voice echoed into the bright corridor and up through the shaft, small enough to stop every living thing for one impossible second. "Mom?" The child's voice came from the dark opening with a softness that did not belong anywhere near the trench. "Mom?" For one suspended second, even the rain seemed to stop. The hidden door in the lower landing stood half open, lock still clicking. White light spilled through the seam, too bright and clean for the rest of the level. Clara made a sound Mason had never heard from an adult before. Not fear. Recognition so pure it stripped language out of her. She stumbled toward the ladder before Aaron caught her wrist. "No," he snapped. "That's my daughter." The words hit the shaft like another shot. Mason looked from Clara to the opening. A little girl stood just inside the room beyond, maybe 5, maybe 6, small enough that the oversized gray institutional shirt almost reached her knees. Her bare feet were planted on white tile. One thin wrist carried a plastic band gone cloudy with wear. Her dark hair had been chopped unevenly at the jaw. And she was looking not at Clara, but at Mara. "Mom?" she asked again, voice shaking now. Clara stopped fighting. Aaron loosened his grip without realizing it. The old man by the pipe stared into the white room. Even Mara, standing in the far corridor, had gone very still. The girl took one step forward into the doorway light. "They said you'd come if I stayed quiet." Clara's face emptied. Mason felt the whole shape of the place shift under him. Families. Ghost barked from the top of the trench, violent and urgent, dragging Mason's attention upward just in time. A red laser dot slid over the trench wall, then over Mason's shoulder. Another vehicle door slammed on the ridge. The surface team had closed in. Mason dropped lower into the shaft and aimed uphill blind. "Ghost! Cover!" The shepherd answered with a roar and the heavy crash of a body hitting wet earth. Below, the little girl flinched at the noise and stepped backward. Clara reached one hand into the shaft as if distance could be crossed by will alone. "Lena," she whispered. The child's eyes shifted at that. For the first time, She looked at Clara. Not with recognition. With confusion. Mara found her voice before anyone else did. "Subject 8, she said calmly. "Return to the room." The girl's face changed at the title. Fear hardened over whatever hope had brought her to the doorway. Clara went white. "Don't call her that." Mason looked sharply at Mara. "You number the children?" Mara's answer came through the corridor speakers and through the hall itself at the same time, cold and level. "You number what must not be misplaced." Aaron's knife stopped moving on the cuff pin. The old man shut his eye for 1 second, then opened it again with something darker in it. "Told you," he whispered. Gunfire erupted above the trench. Dirt rained through the opening. Ghost's bark broke into a snarl, then a man screamed. Mason fired one fast round toward the ridge line and heard someone drop behind brush. "Finish the cuff," he shouted down. Aaron resumed sawing. Below them, Lena had not moved. She kept staring at Clara now, trying to reconcile something she felt with something she had been taught. Mason could see it happening in her face. Clara dropped to her knees at the base of the ladder and lowered her voice until it almost vanished. "You used to hate peas," she said. Mara turned her head slightly. Clara kept going, tears shaking loose at last. "You cried whenever thunder started, and you always slept with one shoe off because you said your feet got too hot." Lena blinked. The room behind her came into better view as Mason adjusted the flashlight. Small cot. White walls. Camera dome. Drawing papers taped in rows. Colored handprints on one panel. A child's room hidden inside a transport wing. No. A holding room. A demonstration room. One branch kept intact enough to be shown when needed. Mara was still composed, but the control now looked deliberate, as if she were holding herself together against a force she already knew by name. Lena whispered, "She told me my mother died." Clara's voice broke. "I know." "Then why are you here?" That one question seemed to strike every person in the shaft at once. Clara had no answer small enough for a child, and no truth safe enough to speak under guns, cameras, and waiting men. Mason heard another metallic click farther down the landing. Not from the juvenile room. From the hall beyond Mara. More doors opening. The shield operator reappeared at the far crossing, then a second behind him, both keeping the shaft bracketed but not firing. Waiting for command. Preserving assets. Mara saw Mason reading the angle and gave the tiniest nod. "You can still walk down," she said. "If you do, the upper team stands down and chamber 8 remains dry." Clara made a raw sound. "You bitch." Mara did not look at her. "Emotional language is not leverage. Neither is blood if I reach you first," Aaron said. Mara's gaze shifted to him. Something flickered there. Familiarity. History. Contempt shaped by disappointment. "You were always too susceptible to attachment." Aaron yanked hard at the cuff chain. "And you were always dead behind the eyes." The old man laughed once, bitter as rust. "That part came from her father." Mason seized on it. "Who is her father?" No one answered quickly enough. The shield men advanced one synchronized step. The corridor light behind them changed from white to pulsing amber. Somewhere deeper below, machinery began cycling with a heavy descending rhythm. Clara heard it first. "No." Mason looked at her. "What is that?" She stared at the floor like she could see through it. "Transport cradle." The old man finally gave Mason the piece he needed. "The lower ledger's moving." The word ledger landed wrong. Mara's voice came softer now, which somehow made it worse. "Your concern is misallocated. In 4 minutes, the surface trench collapses. In 3, juvenile hold floods. In 2, the archive leaves with everyone who still matters." Mason's pulse shifted. Ghost barked again above, then yelped. That sound cut through everything. He half rose toward the trench rim, but Aaron snapped, "Stay on the shaft!" Mason looked up anyway. Ghost was still fighting, but the bark had changed. More men above now. If they brought charges, the trench became a grave. Below, Lena took another step into the corridor. Clara reached toward her again. "Baby, come here!" Lena looked at Mara. The child still checked Mara before moving, like fear had learned to call itself trust. Mason saw Clara realize it too. Her face broke in silence. Mara noticed. "Bond imprinting stabilizes transport compliance." Aaron stopped cutting and stared at her like he might truly climb down the ladder barehanded just to tear her throat open. "You did this to children." "I preserve continuity," Mara said. The old man spat blood onto the tile. "Say bloodline. Say breeding. Say what your father built." At the word father, Mara's stillness cracked. Only for a heartbeat. But Mason saw it. Not because she loved the man. Because the wound there was older than loyalty. He stored that away. Gunfire cracked again above the trench. A round screamed off the hatch edge and showered sparks into the shaft. Lena screamed and dropped low. Clara almost climbed the ladder in reflex, Aaron catching the back of her shirt just in time. "Don't!" he barked. Mason looked up toward the rim and saw the bigger problem. Through the narrow opening overhead, beyond the mud and Ghost's snapping shadow, a black object arced down from the ridge. It hit the trench wall near the hatch and began hissing white. "Gas!" Ghost barked once, sharp and furious. Mason ripped off his field scarf, shoved it over his mouth, and kicked the canister toward the far mud bank, but the trench was too narrow. Vapor rolled down immediately, thick and cold, hugging the exposed steel. Below, Aaron saw it and went pale. "Not surface gas. That's retrieval compound." "What does it do?" "Depends what you are worth alive." The old man looked up through the rising white. "Then decide fast, son." Mason stared down at him. The word hit strangely. Wrong and not wrong. Then his flashlight slid across the juvenile room wall behind Lena, and found something taped beside the drawings. A photograph. Old. Edges curled. Color faded. A woman holding an infant wrapped in a hospital blanket. Clara followed the beam and sucked in air so hard it hurt to hear. "That was taken after they told me she was dead." Lena turned and looked at the photograph over her shoulder. "They said this was my mother." Mason pushed the beam closer. The infant's blanket tag was visible. Not a baby name. A stamped code. Subject branch 8. And beneath the photo, half hidden by a child's drawing, another page had been taped to the wall. A list. 3 names. No ages. Clara Mercer. Lena Mercer. Vale Mara. The 3 names on the page seemed to pull the air out of the shaft. Clara Mercer. Lena Mercer. Vale Mara. For one suspended second, no one moved. White vapor curled down from the trench lip. Rain hissed above. Ghost barked into the gas, coughing once, then barking harder. Mason kept the flashlight locked on the list. Not one family. 2. Interlocked. Clara saw it first in his face, and shook her head before he could ask. "No," she whispered. "Don't." Lena turned from the photograph to the page, and then to Clara, trying to fit adult terror into a shape a child could survive. Mara stood in the corridor beyond the juvenile room, still as tile, but the control in her face had gone brittle. Aaron spoke first. "What is she to you?" He wasn't asking Clara. Clara answered anyway, voice breaking. "She was 6 when they took her." Lena frowned. "Who?" "Mara," Clara said. "She was my first daughter." The old man at the landing wall shut his good eye and exhaled through his teeth. Aaron's grip tightened on the broken cuff chain. Mason heard Ghost's bark go sharper, Then a burst of gunfire stitched the trench rim. Mara finally moved. One step. No more. "That isn't operationally relevant," she said. Clara laughed once in disbelief. "You are standing between me and my child, and you're still speaking their language." Lena looked between them, breath hitching. "She's my sister?" Clara's mouth opened, but no answer came. Lena stepped backward into the white room. Mara noticed and changed tone instantly. "Lena, stay where you are." Clara flinched. Aaron looked at Mason. "We're out of seconds." The gas rolling down from the trench had thickened. Above, Ghost's barking broke into a choke and then returned, wilder. The surface team was forcing the rim. Mason drew his pistol. "Clara, can she get to the ladder from that room? There's a secondary lock on the inside frame. She can open it if she's allowed to." Mara's eyes flicked once toward the room controls. Mason saw it and fired. The round smashed the panel beside the juvenile doorway. Sparks burst. Lena screamed and dropped behind the cot. Mara recoiled a half step as emergency lights along the room frame died. Aaron swore. "Now she can't open it." But Mason had seen something else too. When the panel burst, a hidden seam in the wall behind Mara had flashed red. Another door. The old man heard Mason's breath change. "Transport cut through," he said. Mara's stillness returned. "You are making this uglier than it needed to be." Clara's face hardened. "No. You did that when you let them bury me alive and call it continuity." Mara's gaze shifted to her at last. Emotion moved there again. Not affection. Damage. "I was 12. That shut everyone up." Clara's lips parted. "Mara." Mara cut her off. "Don't." Lena peeked over the cot, eyes wet and huge, looking from one woman to the other and finding no safe ground. A new sound rolled up from below the landing. A train. Mason felt it through the steel ladder. Aaron did too. "They're loading." The old man looked down the corridor. "Then the ledger's going with him." "What ledger?" Mason demanded. "Everything they kept," the old man said. "Transfers. Bloodlines. Births. Deaths. Which children they broke. Which ones they preserved. Which operators they declared dead and why." Clara looked at Mara. "And which mothers they lied to." Mara didn't deny it. Above the trench, Ghost gave a sharp, broken bark. Then nothing. Mason's head snapped up. He climbed 2 rungs before Aaron slammed a hand into his boot. "No. That was Ghost. That's what they want." Another second passed. Then Ghost's bark came again, ragged, furious, alive. At the far corridor, the SHIELD team advanced one synchronized pace. Behind them, red hazard lights shifted to pulsing blue. Somewhere deeper below, the train screamed against metal and began to move. Mara heard it and spoke without turning. "Final transfer active. Seal upper juvenile spur." The floor under the landing jolted. The white room door behind Lena began to slide shut. Clara lunged for it, and Aaron had to grab her around the waist to keep her from running into the lower team's line of fire. "Lena!" she screamed. The little girl bolted from behind the cot and hit the narrowing doorway with both palms. Too weak. Too small. The door kept moving. Mason did not think. He dropped from the hatch. Boots hit the landing hard enough to jar his spine. He came up firing one shot into the shield wall, not to kill but to break rhythm, then drove his shoulder into the juvenile door before it could fully seal. The steel slammed into him and stopped halfway. Pain tore through his left side. The door kept trying to close. Lena stared at him from the room, frozen. "Move!" Mason shouted. She didn't. Mara saw it too. Her voice cracked for the first time. "Lena, go!" That did it. The girl ran. Mason caught her one-handed and threw her toward the ladder base where Clara nearly collapsed, grabbing her. Aaron dragged all three back under the shaft. The SHIELD team answered at once. Rounds tore into the landing wall. Mason dropped behind the half-sealed juvenile door as concrete spat into his hair and face. The old man went down with a cry as a round punched through his shoulder. Clara screamed. Lena screamed louder. The lower hall filled with muzzle flash and sparks. Mason fired twice around the bent doorframe, forcing the first shield back. Aaron threw the flashlight into the corridor. The beam skidded, spinning across tile, strobing the lower team's legs and giving Mason one brutal snapshot. 3 shield operators. 1 rifleman behind. Mara already moving toward the red seam in the wall. She was leaving. "Stop her!" Clara screamed. Mason pivoted and fired at the seam. Too late. The hidden transport cut-through slid open, just wide enough to swallow Mara's silhouette. She vanished inside it without looking back. The old man laughed through blood. "There goes your mystery." Lena buried her face in Clara's neck. "I don't want to stay here." "You're not," Clara said, but she sounded like someone lying against history. The juvenile door Mason had jammed against his body gave way another inch. The whole landing lurched right. Everyone grabbed for something. The SHIELD team below staggered. One man went to a knee. Somewhere under the mountain, the moving train took a curve, and the infrastructure around it complained like a living thing. Then a voice came over every speaker at once. Male. Older. Calm. "Upper trench collapse in 10 seconds. Mason's blood went cold. He looked up the shaft. White gas rolled down. Mud sifted from the hatch rim. Through the square of night above, he saw the first black pebbles of loosened trench wall beginning to rattle inward. Aaron heard it too. "We have to climb." Mason looked at the lower corridor, at Mara's vanished seam, at the wounded old man, at Clara clutching Lena, and realized the shape of the failure all at once. If they went up now, the ledger left. If they stayed down, the trench buried. Either way, something was lost. The old man saw it in his face. "Pick the living." That should have made the choice easier. It didn't. Because at that exact moment, through the transport cut-through Mara had escaped into, a small monitor blinked on above the seam. A live feed. Ghost filled the screen. The dog was still fighting on the surface, limping, muzzle bloodied, standing over the trench rim as armed men closed in through the rain. Then one of them drove a shock prod into his side. Ghost dropped out of frame. And the speaker calmly began counting down. 9. Mason moved before the number finished echoing. He hit the ladder and climbed 3 rungs in one burst. Aaron shouted after him. Clara screamed his name. Below, the SHIELD team advanced again. A round tore through the half-sealed juvenile door and smashed the upper rung inches from Mason's hand. He climbed anyway. 8, the speaker said. The shaft had become a throat of gas and mud. Mason's eyes watered. His lungs burned. He reached the hatch lip and saw the surface in broken pieces through rolling vapor. 1 vehicle at the ridge. Another farther back. 3 men closing in from the left. 1 on the right with the shock prod still live. And Ghost on his side at the trench rim trying to rise. Mason fired twice from the hatch. 1 man dropped. Another spun behind the vehicle. The shock prod operator ducked low and vanished into brush. Ghost got 1 front paw under him and pushed. 7. A crack sounded above him. Not a rifle. Earth. The left wall of the trench folded inward 3 feet from his head. Wet soil and roots poured down into the shaft, slamming his shoulder and nearly knocking him backward. He caught the hatch edge with 1 hand and held. Below, Aaron shouted, "Mason!" Mason looked down once. Clara with Lena in her arms. Aaron covering the lower corridor. the old man dragging himself through blood. No route clean. No rescue hole. Then Ghost tried to stand again, and the trench wall behind him began to split from top to bottom like wet paper under strain. 6. Mason understood then. They were going to bury the hatch with the dog above it, and everyone else below it. He could not save the trench, the ledger, the dog, and the people in the shaft all at once. Something had to be chosen. The speaker counted down to 5. And Mason still had not moved. The number hit Mason like a command and a wound at the same time. Ghost was on the collapsing rim above him, half risen, sides heaving, one foreleg shaking under the aftershock of the prod. Below, in the shaft, Clara held Lena so hard it looked painful. Aaron covered the lower corridor with the pistol Mason had dropped him. The old man lay in blood and grit with one hand braced against the wall, his ruined eye fixed on Mason, as if he could see the choice before Mason made it. Pick the living. The problem was that all of them were alive. Mason swung back up through the hatch. He did not think about it. He thought he would split. He came out low into gas and rain, fired once toward the men on the left ridge, and hit the nearest figure hard enough to knock him sideways into the trench wall. Mud fountained. A second man fired back. The round ripped through the hood of Mason's jacket and took cloth, not flesh. Ghost saw Mason and tried to stand again. "Come on!" Mason barked. The dog planted both front paws, failed, slipped, then forced himself upright through sheer refusal. His bark came ragged but full of fight. That was enough. Mason fired twice more, driving the shock prod operator back behind a fallen cedar, then seized Ghost by the harness and dragged him over the stable side of the trench as another section of wall broke loose behind them. 4. The earth gave way. Half the upper trench slumped inward with a wet roar and buried the open hatch to the width of a man's chest. Mason threw himself backward, Ghost with him, and felt mud, stone, roots, and the first wave of collapse hammer across his boots. The hatch ring vanished under sliding soil. For a second all he could see was black earth moving where the shaft had been. Below him, muffled by dirt and steel, someone screamed his name. Aaron? Clara? He could not tell. The vehicle at the ridge line revved hard. One of the remaining men shouted, "Seal it!" Mason rolled onto one knee with Ghost pressed against his side, and saw the truth immediately. The collapse had not fully sealed the hatch. A narrow wedge of darkness still gaped at the far edge where the hinge side resisted the slide. Not enough to climb through standing. Enough to suffocate whoever remained below if the next collapse hit. 3. Mason sprinted for the dropped breaching hammer. A shot cracked past his ear. He hit the mud, rolled, came up with the tool in one hand and the pistol in the other, and returned fire from a kneeling Brace. The man at the cedar vanished. Another move from the truck's far side. Ghost launched 3 steps forward, teeth bared, and stopped only when Mason snapped his name. No wasted motion. No blind charge. The dog pivoted and held the angle, growling, every muscle a wound wrapped around loyalty. Mason hammered the steel lip buried under the mud. Once. Twice. The wedge widened by half an inch. From below came a child's crying. Lena. Then Clara's voice, ragged but unmistakable. "We're still here." Relief hit him so hard it almost became weakness. He killed it. 2. The surface team changed tactics. No more trying to recover him clean. The remaining operator by the truck shouldered a compact launcher. Mason saw the tube come up and knew exactly what the next second meant. He shot the man through the upper arm before the canister left the barrel. The launcher discharged anyway. The round hit the trench wall 6 feet away and burst in a white bloom of choking vapor. Ghost coughed, snarled, and staggered sideways. Mason wrapped the sleeve of his jacket across his own mouth and hit the hatch again with the hammer. The steel rang. The wedge widened. 1. The countdown ended in silence. For half a beat nothing happened. Then the world under Mason's knees slammed downward. Not another collapse. A lock release. Deep below the buried hatch, something immense disengaged. The half-sealed trench trembled. Mud slid. The steel beneath the dirt shuddered once, and shifted an inch sideways on hidden tracks. Mason froze. That had not been the mountain falling shut. That had been the mechanism waking. From the darkness under the hinge side came a burst of white air, and a new sound underneath the cries and gunfire and rain. A train horn. Not loud. Not near. But impossible to mistake. It rose from somewhere beneath the shaft and rolled out through the half-buried opening, like the last warning a buried world could give. Ghost stopped coughing and looked down at the gap. Not at the men. Not at the guns. At the hidden movement below. Mason dropped flat and shouted into the opening. "Aaron!" The answer came through dirt and metal. "Still here. Can you move?" "Yes." "Can Clara move?" A beat. Then, "Not fast." That beat told Mason more than the words did. He hammered the steel again. Mud loosened. The wedge widened enough for his forearm. He shoved the flashlight down through it. The beam knifed through the dust and showed a nightmare of partial geometry. Ladder twisted but intact. Clara crouched at the base with Lena crushed to her chest. Aaron braced over them with the pistol, the old man dragging himself upright through blood, and beyond them, the lower corridor pulsing with white emergency light, while water sheeted across the tile from some newly opened source. The SHIELD team was still there too. 3 black figures advancing through spray and flicker, slower now, weapons lowered not out of mercy but caution. Because behind them, from the deeper hall, another door was opening. Aaron followed Mason's light with his face, then looked back toward the hall. When he turned up again, something had changed in him. Not fear. Recognition. "Mason!" he shouted. "Get them out now! Working on it!" "No!" Aaron's voice cracked through the mud and metal so hard Mason stopped moving for 1 second. "Not because of them." The deeper hall light changed from white to cold blue. The SHIELD operators stepped aside. Not retreating. Making space. A smaller figure walked between them. Female. Mid-30s. Dark hair slicked back. Gray coat dry despite the water. Mara Vale. She moved through the lower corridor without hurry, one hand resting against something behind her that the angle hid. Lena stopped crying the instant she saw her. Clara went rigid in a way Mason felt through the beam. Mara spoke, and the buried shaft carried her voice upward with eerie clarity. "Subject 8 recovered. Subject line cross confirmed. You should have accepted the chamber, Mason." Mason's hand tightened on the hammer. "Open the hatch more," Aaron said below. But he wasn't looking at the hatch. He was looking at whatever Mara had her hand on. Mason drove the hammer down again. Steel shrieked. The hinge side buckled another inch. Ghost barked once, furious and hoarse. The operator by the truck had found his sidearm. Mason saw the muzzle come up through the gas haze and fired first. The man dropped behind the wheel well. Good. Not dead. Busy. Mason slammed the hammer again. The wedge became a gap. Enough now to see more of the lower hall. Enough to see what Mara was standing beside. Not a control box. Not a transport cradle. A small wheeled chair with steel restraints at the arms. And sitting in it, wrists secured, head hanging forward under wet dark hair, was a woman Mason recognized even before Aaron did. Tessa. Except not the Tessa from the intake chamber. Older in the face somehow. Cleaner. Drugged. Bruised fresh. A match. A duplicate. No. A sister. Clara made the sound first. Not words. Just the sound a wound would make if it suddenly remembered being a body. Mara's voice stayed calm. Clara Mercer. Tessa Mercer. Lena Mercer. She looked up toward Mason through the wrecked shaft and finally gave him the major reveal the mountain had been carrying toward him since Ghost first refused dinner. 1 branch, she said. 3 generations. And none of you have asked the right question. Mason stared down at the drugged woman in the chair. Aaron whispered from below, Jesus. Clara's mouth moved but no sound came. Lena looked up at her mother, then at the woman in the chair, and asked the question a child would ask because children aim where adults evade. She looks like you. Mara almost smiled. No, she said. Then she lifted Tessa's chin by the hair, so the flashlight beam caught the full face at last. She looks like me. And Mason saw it. The mouth. The eyes. The bloodline. Not just Clara's daughter. Not just Lena's mother. Tessa Mercer was Elias Vale's child too, which meant Lena was not just Clara's daughter. She was Mara's niece. And somewhere in the architecture of this mountain, the archive had kept them orbiting one name for years. Above the trench, Ghost barked into gas and darkness. Below, Clara found her voice. My God, she whispered. Mara looked straight up at Mason. Now ask who you were bred to replace. The number hit Mason like a command and a wound at the same time. Ghost was on the collapsing rim above him, half risen, sides heaving, one foreleg shaking under the aftershock of the prod. Below, in the shaft, Clara held Lena so hard it looked painful. Aaron covered the lower corridor with the pistol Mason had dropped him. The old man lay in blood and grit with one hand braced against the wall, his ruined eye fixed on Mason, as if he could see the choice before Mason made it. Pick the living. The problem was that all of them were alive. Mason swung back up through the hatch. He did not think about it. If he thought, he would split. He came out low into gas and rain, fired once toward the men on the left ridge, and hit the nearest figure hard enough to knock him sideways into the trench wall. Mud fountained. A second man fired back. The round ripped through the hood of Mason's jacket and took cloth, not flesh. Ghost saw Mason and tried to stand again. Come on, Mason barked. The dog planted both front paws, failed, slipped, then forced himself upright through sheer refusal. His bark came ragged but full of fight. That was enough. Mason fired twice more, driving the shock prod operator back behind a fallen cedar, then seized Ghost by the harness and dragged him over the stable side of the trench as another section of wall broke loose behind them. 4. The earth gave way. Half the upper trench slumped inward with a wet roar and buried the open hatch to the width of a man's chest. Mason threw himself backward, Ghost with him, and felt mud, stone, roots, and the first wave of collapse hammer across his boots. The hatch ring vanished under sliding soil. For a second all he could see was black earth moving where the shaft had been. Below him, muffled by dirt and steel, someone screamed his name. Aaron? Clara? He could not tell. The vehicle at the ridge line revved hard. One of the remaining men shouted, Seal it! Mason rolled onto one knee with Ghost pressed against his side, and saw the truth immediately. The collapse had not fully sealed the hatch. A narrow wedge of darkness still gaped at the far edge where the hinge side resisted the slide. Not enough to climb through standing. Enough to suffocate whoever remained below if the next collapse hit. 3. Mason sprinted for the dropped breaching hammer. A shot cracked past his ear. He hit the mud, rolled, came up with the tool in one hand and the pistol in the other, and returned fire from a kneeling Brace. The man at the cedar vanished. Another move from the truck's far side. Ghost launched 3 steps forward, teeth bared, and stopped only when Mason snapped his name. No wasted motion. No blind charge. The dog pivoted and held the angle, growling, every muscle a wound wrapped around loyalty. Mason hammered the steel lip buried under the mud. Once. Twice. The wedge widened by half an inch. From below came a child's crying. Lena. Then Clara's voice, ragged but unmistakable. "We're still here." Relief hit him so hard it almost became weakness. He killed it. The surface team changed tactics. The remaining operator by the truck shouldered a compact launcher. Mason saw the tube come up and knew exactly what the next second meant. He shot the man through the upper arm before the canister left the barrel. The launcher discharged anyway. The round hit the trench wall 6 feet away and burst in a white bloom of choking vapor. Ghost coughed, snarled, and staggered sideways. Mason wrapped the sleeve of his jacket across his own mouth and hit the hatch again with the hammer. The steel rang. The wedge widened. 2. The countdown ended in silence. For half a beat nothing happened. Then the world under Mason's knees slammed downward. Not another collapse. A lock release. Deep below the buried hatch, something immense disengaged. The half-sealed trench trembled. Mud slid. The steel beneath the dirt shuddered once, and shifted an inch sideways on hidden tracks. Mason froze. That had not been the mountain falling shut. That had been the mechanism waking. From the darkness under the hinge side came a burst of white air, and a new sound underneath the cries and gunfire and rain. A train horn. Not loud. Not near. But impossible to mistake. It rose from somewhere beneath the shaft and rolled out through the half-buried opening, like the last warning a buried world could give. Ghost stopped coughing and looked down at the gap. Not at the men. At the hidden movement below. Mason dropped flat and shouted into the opening. "Aaron!" The answer came through dirt and metal. "Still here. Can you move?" "Yes." "Can Clara move?" A beat. Then, "Not fast." That beat told Mason more than the words did. He hammered the steel again. Mud loosened. The wedge widened enough for his forearm. He shoved the flashlight down through it. The beam knifed through the dust and showed a nightmare of partial geometry. Ladder twisted but intact. Clara crouched at the base with Lena crushed to her chest. Aaron braced over them with the pistol, the old man dragging himself upright through blood, and beyond them, the lower corridor pulsing with white emergency light, while water sheeted across the tile from some newly opened source. The SHIELD team was still there too. 3 black figures advancing through spray and flicker, slower now, weapons lowered not out of mercy but caution. Because behind them, from the deeper hall, another door was opening. Aaron followed Mason's light with his face, then looked back toward the hall. When he turned up again, something had changed in him. Not fear. Recognition. "Mason!" he shouted. "Get them out now! Working on it!" "No!" Aaron's voice cracked through the mud and metal so hard Mason stopped moving for 1 second. "Not because of them." The deeper hall light changed from white to cold blue. The SHIELD operators stepped aside. Not retreating. Making space. A smaller figure walked between them. Female. Mid-30s. Dark hair slicked back. Gray coat dry despite the water. Mara Vale. She moved through the lower corridor without hurry, one hand resting against something behind her that the angle hid. Lena stopped crying the instant she saw her. Clara went rigid in a way Mason felt through the beam. Mara spoke, and the buried shaft carried her voice upward with eerie clarity. "Subject 8 recovered. Subject line cross confirmed. You should have accepted the chamber, Mason." Mason's hand tightened on the hammer. "Open the hatch more," Aaron said below. But he wasn't looking at the hatch. He was looking at whatever Mara had her hand on. Mason drove the hammer down again. Steel shrieked. The hinge side buckled another inch. The wedge became a gap. Enough now to see more of the lower hall. Enough to see what Mara was standing beside. Not a control box. Not a transport cradle. A small wheeled chair with steel restraints at the arms. And sitting in it, wrists secured, head hanging forward under wet dark hair, was a woman Mason recognized even before Aaron did. Tessa. Except not the Tessa from the intake chamber. Older in the face somehow. Cleaner. Drugged. Bruised fresh. A match. A duplicate. No. A sister. Clara made the sound first. Not words. Just the sound a wound would make if it suddenly remembered being a body. Mara's voice stayed calm. Clara Mercer. Tessa Mercer. Lena Mercer. She looked up toward Mason through the wrecked shaft and finally gave him the major reveal the mountain had been carrying toward him since Ghost first refused dinner. 1 branch, she said. 3 generations. And none of you have asked the right question. Mason stared down at the drugged woman in the chair. Aaron whispered from below, Jesus. Clara's mouth moved but no sound came. Lena looked up at her mother, then at the woman in the chair, and asked the question a child would ask because children aim where adults evade. She looks like you. Mara almost smiled. No, she said. Then she lifted Tessa's chin by the hair, so the flashlight beam caught the full face at last. She looks like me. And Mason saw it. The mouth. The eyes. The bloodline. Not just Clara's daughter. Not just Lena's mother. Tessa Mercer was Elias Vale's child too. Which meant Lena was not just Clara's daughter. She was Mara's niece. And somewhere in the machinery of this mountain, the archive had kept them orbiting one bloodline for years. Above the trench, Ghost barked into gas and darkness. Below, Clara found her voice. My God, she whispered. Mara looked straight up at Mason. Now ask who you were bred to replace. Then every light in the lower hall died at once. The blue glow vanished. The white room behind Mara dropped into emergency dark. Somewhere beyond the shields, metal screamed along hidden rails, and the train horn sounded again, closer this time. Aaron's face changed first. Bridge failure, he said. Closer now. The blue glow died so completely it felt like the mountain had blinked. For one breath, the lower hall existed only in fragments, Mason's flashlight shaking through the half-buried hatch, Ghost's bark above the trench, Clara's ragged breathing below, Aaron's silhouette over Lena, and somewhere beyond all of them, the metallic scream of a train braking where it should not have been braking. Aaron's voice cut through first. Bridge failure. Mason dropped lower to the opening. Say that again. The transfer bridge, Aaron snapped. If it failed while the train was moving, they can't clear the lower span. Mara's outline remained in the darkness below, one hand still on Tessa's chair. Incorrect, she said calmly. The train can clear. It simply cannot do so intact. Clara found enough breath to hate her properly again. What did you do? Mara looked not at Clara, but toward the unseen track below. I adjusted timing. That answer hit Mason harder than if she had said sabotage. Not a mistake. Not a malfunction. A choice. The train horn sounded again, louder now, and this time it was followed by the screech of steel sliding under impossible load. Somewhere deep under the landing, something enormous had stopped halfway through somewhere it was never supposed to stop. The surface team above the trench heard it too. A man shouted. Another engine revved. Then the operator Mason had shot earlier screamed for them to fall back from the trench edge. Ghost barked at once, not in fear, but in warning, and Mason knew what the men above were about to do before he saw the first new charge land in the mud 3 feet from the hatch. He grabbed it barehanded on instinct. He bit his palm. He threw it uphill. The charge hit the half-open truck door and detonated in a white burst that punched mud, metal, and one screaming man sideways into the cedar line. The blast rocked the trench, showering dirt through the shaft and nearly tearing the flashlight from Mason's grip. Below, Lena cried out. Clara covered her. Aaron held his stance over both of them. Mara did not flinch. The old man on the lower landing laughed through blood. There. That's the family resemblance. Mason snapped the light toward him. What? The old man dragged himself upright by the ladder base and looked not at Mason, but at Mara. You break your own board when you start losing. Mara's control slipped by a fraction. Be quiet. No, he said. You're finally interesting. Ghost barked again, closer this time. Mason risked a glance upward and saw the shepherd on the trench rim with blood down one leg and gas fogging around his chest, but still standing between the opening and the surviving men above. Two operators were pulling a wounded third back toward the vehicles. A fourth had taken cover behind the engine block and was trying to sight through the steam and dirt. They were no longer closing on the trench. They were waiting. That frightened Mason more than the bullets had. Men stop advancing when something worse is coming. Below, Aaron saw the same shift in Mason's face. What? They're backing off. Clara heard it and went pale. Then they know. Know what? Mason asked. No one answered fast enough. The answer came from the infrastructure itself. A hard magnetic thunk rolled through the lower hall. Then another. Then a chain of them deeper below, left to right, as if sealed doors were opening in sequence somewhere alongside the failed train. The old man shut his eye once. Contingency release, Clara whispered. No. Mason looked between them. What does that mean? Aaron didn't look away from the corridor. It means if transport fails, they don't save everything. Ghost's bark changed above the trench. Not attack. Alarm. Something was coming across the ridge behind the vehicles. Mason twisted just enough to see through rain and gas. Lights. Not tactical beams this time. Floodlights on a track machine easing down the service road through mud, heavy enough to make the whole slope shudder. Excavator. Arm folded. Bucket raised. Not brought to recover men. Brought to bury holes. Mason's pulse went cold. They brought a digger. Clara made a broken sound. Aaron closed his eyes once and opened them harder. Mara, for the first time since stepping into the hall, looked up sharply toward the shaft. That was when Mason understood the next part. The machine was not just for the trench. It was for the entire upper breach. If the train had stalled below and the bridge had failed, they were about to collapse every unstable access point and leave the archive cars that had already cleared to continue without witnesses. The ones who had not cleared were disposable. The old man saw the realization land and nodded once. Now you understand what family means to them. Mason shoved the beam back into the lower hall. Mara was moving now, not backward towards safety, but sideways toward the chair holding Tessa. She unclipped one restraint with clinical speed and then paused, as if measuring the problem again in real time. Clara saw it. Don't touch her. Mara ignored her. She is still viable. Lena looked up through tears. What does that mean? Nobody answered. The lower corridor answered for them. From beyond the unseen rail span came a chorus of distant impacts, doors, maybe, or containment shutters, and then the unmistakable sound of human feet running where no one had wanted people running. Not one or two. Many. The shield operators in the hall changed posture instantly. Rifles came up. Spacing widened. Attention shifted away from the shaft. Mason followed their line, and finally saw beyond them what the flashlight had not reached before. At the far bend, beneath a flickering red strip, movement burst through the white spray. People. Gaunt. Barefoot. Gray institutional shirts soaked through. Some dragging restraints. Some helping others. All running from something behind them. One woman fell. Two men tried to pull her up. None of them stopped for long. The failed train had not simply stalled transport. It had opened whatever was still locked near the lower span. Clara went dead white. Branches. Aaron swore under his breath. All of them? Enough, the old man said. Mara's face hardened. No. For the first time, the word sounded like fear. One of the shield operators shouted something into his mask, and the team pivoted to form a barrier across the hall. Not against Mason. Against the oncoming flood of living subjects. Then the first of the fleeing people reached the edge of the light, and Mason saw why the upper team had stopped advancing on the trench. Some of those running were children. Not just Lena's age. Younger. Older. Entire lines of them. A boy with a shaved head and one leg brace. A teen girl with a black tag cable tied around her wrist. A mother carrying a child too limp to walk. A man with the same eyes as another man beside him. Bloodlines. Branches. Catalogued and moved like stock. And now, because of the failed transfer, they were flooding toward the only open vertical route Mason had exposed. The shaft. Ghost barked wildly above, sensing the same geometry from a world away. Mason looked from the living tide below to the excavator crawling down the ridge above, and felt the near shape of resolution twist apart in his hands. He could see the way out now. Not a clean one, but a path. Open the hatch wider. Get Clara, Lena, Aaron, Tessa, the old man up first. Then as many of the others as possible before the digger collapsed the trench. It was desperate. It was ugly. It was possible. And because it was possible, the mountain chose that moment to reveal the next betrayal. The juvenile room behind Mara lit up again. Not with emergency white. With warm, soft light. Domestic. Wrong. A hidden screen in the wall woke and filled the room with an old photograph Mason had never seen before but understood in a single violent second. A much younger Elias Vale stood beside a woman Mason did not know. In the woman's arms was an infant. In Elias's arms was another. 2 babies. Same blanket. Same date stamp. Different labels beneath them. Vale Mara. Reed Mason. Mason stopped breathing. The whole hall seemed to stop with him. Clara stared at the image. Aaron lowered the pistol an inch without meaning to. Even the shield team faltered for one fatal beat as the line of running subjects kept coming. Mara looked at the photo and went completely still. Mara looked at the other cradle like fire. The old man shut his eye. Then, quietly enough that only the shaft and the people trapped in its logic could hear him, he gave Mason the near-resolution twist the mountain had been saving for the worst possible second. "You were never bred to replace anyone," he said. Mason tore his eyes from the screen and looked down. The old man met his stare through blood, spray, and ruin. "You were the original." The words hit Mason harder than the gunfire ever had. You were the original. For one suspended second, the mountain, the trench, the screaming subjects, the stalled train below, and the excavator in the rain all seemed to step back from that sentence and leave him alone with the photograph glowing in the juvenile room. 2 infants. 2 labels. 1 bloodline split before either child could choose a name. Mara. Mason. Ghost barked from the trench rim, sharp and furious, and the sound snapped the world back into motion. The branches fleeing from below were almost at the landing now. The hall had become what Elias Vale had hidden all along, a breeding archive losing control of its own inventory. Mara looked at Mason. "You shouldn't have seen that," she said. Mason's answer came out rough. "You shouldn't have built any of this." Above the trench, the excavator's bucket bit into the ridge. Earth groaned. Stones rattled into the shaft. Ghost jumped back, then returned to the edge immediately, barking into the machine noise as if he could hold the mountain apart by refusing to yield. Aaron heard it, and made the next decision first. "Give Lena up." Clara snapped toward him. No. Tessa won't move if we don't wake her. Lena climbs now. Lena was still staring at the photograph. Clara caught her shoulders and turned her away from it. Baby, look at me. Lena did. You climb when he tells you. You don't stop. You don't look back. Lena's lip trembled. What about you? I'm right behind you. The old man at the landing base looked up at Mason. Stop trying to save the architecture. Save the people. Mason nodded once. He shoved both arms into the half-open gap. Mud and steel tore skin from his forearms as he fought the buried hatch upward. The warp hinge shrieked. The opening widened. Enough. Lena! Aaron lifted the girl onto the ladder. Ghost's head appeared above the rim, eyes blazing. The second he saw Lena climbing toward him, the dog shifted from rage to guard mode and planted himself across the opening. The hall behind Aaron erupted. The fleeing branches hit the shield line in a desperate wave. The operators fired stun batons and gas bursts into the crowd, but there were too many. Mara shouted, "Hold the lane!" No one obeyed cleanly. Bodies hit shields. Children cried. The ladder base vanished in chaos. Mason hauled Lena the last 3 feet out of the hatch and shoved her clear of the rim just as the excavator's bucket crashed into the trench wall again. The whole slope jumped. Mud poured into the gap. Ghost snarled at the machine. Lena hit the rain and immediately turned back toward the opening. Mom! Mason caught her by the shirt and dragged her behind the shattered hatch slab. Stay down! Below, Clara had stopped because Tessa, still in the chair, had begun to stir. Mara, Clara said. The name came out differently now. Not hatred. Grief. Mara's jaw tightened. Don't! Tessa is your sister too. I know what she is. Tessa made a small, drugged sound and lifted her head. Her eyes opened halfway. She looked from Clara to Lena to Mara. Clara? Clara went to her instantly. Aaron caught at her sleeve and missed. She dropped beside the chair, hand shaking, and touched Tessa's face like she was afraid the skin would vanish. I'm here, Clara whispered. Tessa blinked. They said you drowned. Clara laughed and cried in the same breath. They lie for a living. Mara looked away. Mason saw it. A crack, the first place this machine had failed inside her. He seized it. Mara! He shouted down through the hatch. Her eyes snapped up. You want to know what makes me different from Elias? Mason said. I'm standing in the one thing he never understood. The excavator clawed deeper into the slope. Ghost barked, coughed, barked again. Rain sheeted through the trench. Mason pointed down at Clara, Lena, Tessa, Aaron, the old man, and the children flooding the hall. This, he said. People choose each other faster than systems can own them. The old man saw Mara break and drove the point deeper. He built us like a ledger. You don't have to stay written in his hand. Another blow from the excavator split the trench wall. Mason nearly lost his grip on the hatch. Mud slammed against his back. Lena screamed above him. Ghost threw himself between the falling debris and the child without hesitation. That decided everything. Aaron shoved the first frightened child from the branch wave toward the ladder. Climb! The boy froze. Ghost barked once from above, sharp and commanding. The child climbed. Then another did. The shield line broke fully. One operator went down under desperate bodies. Another backed away, firing gas into the floor. The third looked to Mara for command and found none. He hesitated. That killed him. The fleeing branches surged through the gap and swallowed the lane. Mara stepped back from the tide instinctively, one hand still on Tessa's chair. Clara saw the motion and seized it. She ripped the restraint buckle free. Aaron took the other side. Together they dragged Tessa out of the chair and toward the ladder base. Mara did not stop them. The old man watched her and understood before Mason did. "She's done," he said. Mason shoved the hatch higher with one last brutal wrench. The buried steel groaned and rose just enough to make the opening survivable for adults. Aaron boosted Clara first because she had Tessa's arm hooked over one shoulder and would refuse to go otherwise. Mason met them at the rim, grabbed Tessa under the arms, and hauled her into rain and mud while Clara crawled out on bleeding hands. Lena threw herself into her mother and nearly knocked all three back into the trench. Aaron shoved the next child upward. The old man waved the rest past him, staying low at the wall, using what breath and blood he had left to keep them moving. "Up!" he kept saying. "Mason!" Aaron's shout cut through the rain. He was still below. And so was Mara. She had not fled. She stood in the middle of the landing chaos with her coat soaked now, dark hair loose against her face, looking up through the hatch at Mason the way a person looks at an exit she no longer believes she deserves. Behind her, the lower rail screamed again. The stalled train had begun to move backward. Wrong direction. Fast. The old man heard it and went dead pale. "Run!" Mara finally spoke, and the words were for Mason alone. "If it rolls back into the cradle, the vault floods." "How long?" "Seconds." Aaron grabbed the old man and shoved him at the ladder. The man resisted once, then gave in. Mara did not move. Mason understood the final shape of it. If she stayed, she died here with the archive. If she climbed, she left the system alive behind her. He leaned down through rain and collapsing mud and offered Mara his hand. For one suspended beat, she just stared at it. Ghost stepped to Mason's side, shaking, muddy, bleeding, and placed one paw against Mason's thigh like an anchor. Mara looked at the dog, then at Mason's hand, then at the hall behind her where the failed archive was losing itself in spray and screaming steel. And in the smallest, most human voice Mason had heard from her all night, she said, "I don't know how to be anything after this." Mason's answer came before the mountain could. "Then start by surviving." Her hand hit his. Aaron shoved from below. Mason pulled from above. Ghost braced against Mason's legs. Mara cleared the rim just as the trench gave way behind them. The hatch vanished in a roar of mud, steel, roots, white water, and the backward crashing scream of a train hitting the flooded cradle below. The blast of air threw all of them flat into the rain. Then the slope went still except for runoff, breath, and Ghost's ragged panting. No one moved for 3 full seconds. Then Lena began crying. Then Clara. Then Tessa, half-conscious and shaking. Then Aaron laughed once, like a man who had been declared dead too long to understand his own pulse anymore. Mason rolled onto one elbow and found Ghost first. The shepherd was alive. Shaking. Exhausted. Still trying to rise and return to the broken trench, because loyalty had not yet been informed the fight was over. Mason caught him, pulled him close, and pressed his forehead against the dog's wet fur. For the first time all night, he let his breathing break. Around him, the survivors gathered in fragments of a family no machine had managed to finish reducing to data. The ridge lightened. Cold blue gave way to gray. And Mason finally understood why Ghost had refused food, refused rest, refused comfort, refused to let the trench stay buried. The dog had not led him to a secret. He had led him to the place where a lie ran out of earth. When the first rescue lights broke through the trees, Mason lifted his head, one hand still buried in Ghost's fur, and looked at the people who had made it out. Not all of them. Never all. But enough. The old man met his eyes across the mud and ruin. "Now they can't write the ending for you." Mason looked once at the collapsed trench. Then at Ghost. Then at the dawn. "No," he said. "We write it ourselves now." and Dawn no longer belonged to the dead.